From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump zeroes in on new picks for who will be joining his cabinet, including as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. While some news outlets, but not others, are now calling the House for the GOP as the nation waits and waits and waits for ballots to be counted, particularly in California. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Kim Strassel. Donald Trump is announcing some of these cabinet picks on Truth Social. Others are leaking out via the news media. Here is the story from the Wall Street Journal. Donald Trump is expected to nominate Senator Marco Rubio of Florida as Secretary of State and has asked Congressman Mike Waltz, a Green Beret veteran, to be his White House National Security Advisor, according to people familiar with his thinking, though the story then cautions that Trump could still change his mind on Marco Rubio. Monet, what do you make of this? Secretary of State job is certainly a big one. Marco Rubio, a one-time rival of Donald Trump's, given the nickname Little Marco, but has taken a bit of a populist turn in recent years. I've been skeptical of some of those moves by Rubio, but this, to my mind, might be the best version of him, not directly involved in economic policy, dealing with labor unions, but out on the world stage, presenting part of his story again about how only in America can the son of Cuban immigrants go on to be the Secretary of the United States.
Yes, I think that Rubio is definitely a good pick for those who favor a strong American defense posture overseas and diplomacy that is fairly aggressive in promoting the American interest as opposed to withdrawing from engagement with our allies and strongly opposing our adversaries. There is a big and influential isolationist wing, some of whom are very close to President Trump, who are trying to persuade him to fill these foreign policy and defense positions with people who favor a drawdown in military buildup, who favor withdrawing from taking aggressive posture towards some of our rivals and enemies. Marco Rubio definitively does not fit into that camp. Earlier in his tenure in the Senate, he was much more in the traditional hawkish wing of the Republican Party and generally favored intervention, particularly in the Middle East, striking aggressively against American adversaries. Like a lot of the Republican Party, he has moderated somewhat on some of those positions during the time that President Trump has gained influence in the Republican Party. In Ukraine, he, for example, started out saying that we needed to aggressively fund the Ukrainian defense, but has soured on that posture as time has gone on, in part because President Biden has so mismanaged the U.S. involvement in that intervention. But he seems pretty closely aligned with Trump's instincts in that he is strongly in favor of deterrence against a lot of American enemies, and does believe that there is still some value in Ukraine continuing to be supported by the United States as long as there's an end game in sight. And perhaps he would support President Trump in pursuing a negotiated settlement there. So there definitely are some areas where he is very much distinguished from some of the worst elements that have arisen in the Republican Party in terms of retrenchment and isolation. And it's likely that a lot of people are angry about his appointment, but it does seem to be a sign that President Trump is going in a fairly traditional direction so far with some of these big influential picks.
Kim, what do you make of these two picks, and what should listeners know about Congressman Mike Waltz at the National Security Council?
So I think what I would say about both of these picks, which should be very reassuring to people, is that they are deeply steeped in their topic matter. Marco Rubio has made a career since he came to the United States Senate in 2010, very much putting himself in the center of a lot of foreign policy debates. He definitely knows what he's talking about. I would echo what Monet says, that Marco Rubio overall is no friend of tyrants. He, for instance, in the Senate has authored legislation to try to put sanctions on Chinese officials responsible for human rights violations against Uyghurs. He's been great on issues like dictators in Cuba and Venezuela. And I agree too with Monet that his stance at the moment on Ukraine rests somewhere in the details. He did vote against the most recent funding. He also gave a speech for an hour long prior to that vote denouncing Russia. He has said that if there were to be a negotiated settlement, it needs to be one that is favorable to Ukraine, one in which it retains its sovereignty and is not allowed to become a puppet state of Russia. So it's not where Biden is and many other Republicans in terms of aid, but he is no friend of Vladimir Putin and is clear-eyed about who is the actual dangers in the world. I think that's a very good starting point for Secretary of State. Mike Waltz, he's a Florida congressman, a former Green Beret who did tours in Afghanistan. Again, deeply steeped in this. He has served on the Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, Intel Committee. By the way, all those postings are signed as not just somebody who knows their subject matter, but is considered serious, especially if you get an Intel Committee position. A little interesting background, his wife actually served as a Homeland Security advisor in the first Trump administration. And he has always been close to Trump, even from the House when Trump was the president. He was often calling Waltz. They had a big line of communication on the question of foreign policy. He viciously opposed Biden's withdrawal of Afghanistan. And I think this is notable at the time. He also was very firm when Trump was president that there should not be a withdrawal from Afghanistan unless there were very stringent conditions attached to it, including some proof that the Taliban was not in league with al-Qaeda, etc. He's also, I think this is notable for NSC pick, been a big critic of woke policies in the defense forces. And we haven't talked about that, but that's likely to be another area that Trump goes after quite vigorously. He's voted against Ukraine aid more recently, but he's also made a point that the goal here needs to be to isolate Putin by drawing Ukraine more closely to the West. So I think both of these guys, they know what they're about and they represent a pretty strong foreign policy stance that does seem to be in line with Donald Trump's generally about peace through strength. And I think they're a good indicator maybe of where Trump might be headed on some of these issues.
A couple of other picks here. One in another media report, President-elect Donald Trump has selected South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem as his next Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. That is according to people familiar with this selection in a CNN write-up. And then here is one that is official, straight from Truth Social. Donald Trump saying that he is going to appoint Lee Zeldin, the former congressman from New York, as the head of the Environmental Protection Agency to ensure fair and swift deregulatory decisions, unleash the power of American businesses while maintaining high environmental standards. Here is Lee Zeldin on Fox News yesterday.
Through the EPA, we have the ability to pursue energy dominance, to be able to make the United States the artificial intelligence capital of the world, to bring back American jobs to the auto industry, and so much more. President Trump cares about conserving the environment, his desire to ensure clean access to clean air, clean water. It was a top priority. So I'm excited to get into work to implement President Trump's economic agenda, and I think the American people are so hungry for it. It's one of the big reasons why they're sending him back to the White House.
Monet, what do you make of these picks? I guess my 2 cents here are that a lot of these cabinet jobs are management jobs, running the EPA, a big organization, the Department of Homeland Security, pretty sizable compared with the state government of South Dakota. And let's hope these 2 picks are up to the task.
Well, I have to confess, I worry a little bit about the Noem pick for the Department of Homeland Security, in part because it is such a big and sprawling agency, which has important and varied responsibilities. It's very difficult to manage. And from her record as governor of South Dakota, she has been plagued by a few minor scandals, probably nothing to really set her career off course, but allegations of misspending and things like that. She's also been known to put her foot in her mouth sometimes when she appears on cable news in defense of things like vetoing a policy about transgenderism in her state. Is definitely a polished media figure, but is not always the most buttoned up and able communicator. And there are going to be a lot of fires to put out when it comes to securing the border and also implementing President Trump's policy for deporting a lot of illegal aliens, beginning with criminals. And so I think she's going to be the face in part of a lot of that border agenda. And it's possible that she could be dragged down by the inability to really communicate exactly what the Trump administration is doing, and perhaps some of her own personal inability to really manage that very huge agency. Of course, that has to be put in the context of the fact that Tom Homan has been appointed as border czar, who has quite a lot more direct experience working on border policy. He'll probably be more of the brain in terms of devising the policies and also implementing a lot of them. But I do think that as much as President Trump wanted to reward Kristi Noem for her loyalty to the campaign, it would have been beneficial to have someone with a little bit more border experience and who was a little bit more careful in that role. With regard to Lee Zeldin, I think that it's a good pick. He also, of course, doesn't necessarily have a ton of direct experience on managing climate policy, but he seems very much aligned with what President Trump wants to do. He has promised to do the work of repealing a lot of the regulations that stifle energy production and things of that kind. And that's something where a lot of the policy professionals surrounding him will be able to put together the agenda, and he will be able to focus much more on making sure that things are swiftly implemented, as opposed to having to react to big crises that are going to pop up in the way that the Secretary of Homeland Security has to. So I expect him to be able to fulfill Trump's agenda on that without too much controversy or trouble.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Kim, anything you'd add on those two picks? And what do you make of the fact that, granted, there are still lots of roles to be doled out here, but at least in these initial announcements, Trump is keeping within mainstream Republican political figures, former congressmen of New York, for example, governors. It maybe part of that reflects the fact that he has remade the party. And when he came in 2016, he had much more interest in going outside the Republican Party, picking generals, picking big businessmen, Rex Tillerson being a prime example. And granted, there is a lot left to go here, but given the whole range of options that Trump could go for here, he seems to be picking kind of within, I think, Reaganite, more or less policy.
Generally, I think that that's generally correct. A couple of things I would just note generally about his picks, which I think is notable given his own age, is the youth of many of these picks. I mean, the relative youth. This is a new face and a new generation of Republican leaders. And by being put in some of these positions, it will further cement them in the hierarchy of Republican politics. I think also that he often has a quirky way of looking at some of his choices, and they bring different perspectives to the job. I don't always think that's a bad thing. I think the past way of sometimes just reverting to the usual suspects does end up kind of the usual policy. And Trump has a way of bringing people in that he thinks are going to look at a problem from a different angle. My advice, and this wasn't necessarily what you asked me, but I do have a piece of advice for these two picks, but also for pretty much anyone else that's going to get named to the Trump cabinet. And this goes in particular for Lee Zeldin, is that I would come into Washington handcuffed to a really quality general counsel who you run everything by before you make any big decisions. What we've seen in the first Trump administration, especially in positions that had to do with the environment, and that would be EPA, Interior, et cetera, is that environmental groups out there, liberal interest groups, they are very well funded. They have a lot of allies who work within the bureaucracy as well. Kind of that deep state we talk about sometimes. They have a lot of money to bring lawsuits. And if you step out of anything that they consider legal line, they will bring an onslaught against you. Scott Pruitt learned that the hard way when he was at EPA. Ryan Zinke came in for an onslaught when he was in Interior. And it doesn't have to happen. If you know what's waiting for you, you can run the traps, but you've just got to make sure that you are aware of what's waiting for you, because it's waiting for you.
Meantime, the House has finally gone over to the GOP, or not, depending on which news you choose, since ballots are continuing to straggle in. Analysts differing on which race races they have called. According to the Associated Press, there are still 17 uncalled House races. It has not gotten the Republicans to 18 control yet. Notably, Monet, 9 of those 17 uncalled races are in California. The deadline, if you mailed your ballot on Election Day and it was postmarked, the deadline for the mailman to bring that ballot and still have it counted is today, Tuesday, 1 week after Election Day. California also lets people who have signature problems or rejected ballots fix those issues until the early days of December. So it's possible that some of these races, if they are very, very close, we could still be waiting on for weeks now. The latest update from the California Secretary of State, the estimate is that there are still 2.5 million unprocessed ballots statewide. And Monet, I'll get off my soapbox now here on this question, but astounding here that more than half of the races that we still don't have answers on yet are in California, some of which might not even end up being all that close.
California has become famous many times over for its absolute inability to count ballots in a timely manner. And there really are 2 locuses of incompetence here, one of which is in the State House, because as you described, they have laws which allow these ballots to come in as late as a week after Election Day and be counted. And that is a policy that could be changed immediately by legislators in Sacramento if they decided to go ahead and pass a law requiring those ballots to be in by Election Day or shortly thereafter. And so going through several cycles now where this has delayed tallies in a lot of these very close races, it makes no sense that they haven't gone ahead and done this. And because of the sheer number of districts in California, you have a lot of places where races are always going to come down to very, very narrow margins. So it's such a predictable crisis that we keep going through. The other seat of incompetence, of course, is at the more local level when it comes to the county level officials who are actually in charge of tallying up these votes. It's hard to see exactly what the nature of some of these problems is beyond the burden that the bad rules places on them. But it does seem like it needs to be essentially a bipartisan project in California to make sure that these people have a better plan in place for actually getting these things tallied in a secure and timely manner. And it does seem as if at the end of the day, it's going to be something like a 4-seat margin for Republicans. But the fact that we're a week out at this point and Congress is starting to take shape, but they're not able to actually plan based on knowing what that vote count is going to be, just seems like a completely needless and very predictable at this point scenario for us to find ourselves in.